It's a very erotic scene, and
Well, it's not. That's very funny because are sex on the train?
At 60, most Hollywood icons cling to their secrets like jewelry, polished, protected, passed down from one decade to the next. They smile at red carpets, answer questions with well-trained charm, and let the world believe that their private lives are as calm and controlled as the photoshopped magazines they appear in. But Diane Lane isn't like most Hollywood icons. She never was. She entered the industry at 14, wide-eyed, fiery, impossible to mold, and she grew into one of the most mesmerizing actresses of her generation. Her career survived scandals, career droughts, comebacks, heartbreaks, and triumphs. Her beauty remained timeless, her talent unshakable. And yet, the most whispered about details of her life were never in the script she starred in. They were in the rumors. Whispers passed between producers at private dinners. Late-night secrets shared between directors after too much whiskey. Paparazzi speculation that lingered for years without confirmation. Because behind Diana's grace and quiet confidence lived a past she never fully acknowledged. A past made of moments stolen in dressing rooms, hotel suites, backstage corridors, and late-night phone calls that could have ended careers if they'd ever been exposed. For decades, Hollywood insiders asked the same question. Who were the men? Who were the 7 artists who crossed the line from co-stars to lovers? Who were the ones who experienced the passion the world only guessed at? Tonight, Diane Lane finally answers. She doesn't whisper. She doesn't hold back. She doesn't protect reputations that were built on lies and polished facades. At 60, she has nothing left to fear. Not the tabloids. Not the fans. Not the studios. Not the consequences. She is finally ready to speak, not out of spite, not out of vanity, but because the truth has been burning inside her for decades. These were not ordinary affairs. They were defining moments, 7 encounters that shaped her as a woman, an artist, and a survivor of Hollywood's most seductive illusions. Some were forbidden. Some were reckless. Some were dangerous. Some nearly destroyed her. But all 7 were unforgettable. And the first name on her list is the man who began everything, not because he was her first love, but because he was the first to ignite a desire in her that she didn't yet understand. His name? Elias Red. Diane Lane's connection with artists wasn't just about romance, it was about intensity, creativity, and the kind of emotional electricity that only exists behind closed doors. Each man represented a completely different chapter of her life, and according to insiders, she approached every experience with the same honesty she brings to her performances. One person close to the actress once said she had a magnetic pull toward people who lived at the edge of their imagination. These weren't casual flings. They were passionate storms, short, bright, unforgettable. During this period, Diane was traveling constantly for film shoots, red carpet events, and private art gatherings. She often found herself surrounded by painters, musicians, photographers, and sculptors, many of whom admired her as a muse as much as they desired her as a woman. Some even created entire pieces inspired by her, calling her a living contradiction of softness and fire. What made these affairs even more fascinating is that Diane never sought attention for them. While other celebrities bragged about high-profile relationships, she kept her personal life locked away, refusing to turn it into headlines. Even today, the only reason these stories exist is because some of the artists eventually spoke publicly, not out of betrayal, but admiration. Each affair, as Diane herself later hinted, taught me something about being alive. She described those years as a period of fearless living, where she refused to dim her personality to fit anyone's expectations. And perhaps that's why these 7 artists still speak of her with a kind of reverence. She wasn't just a partner, she was an experience. But this chapter of her life also held its share of heartbreaks. Creative souls can burn brightly, but they can burn out just as quickly. Some relationships ended suddenly, some faded quietly, and some never truly ended, they simply changed shape. And as Diane approached her 60s, she finally decided she was ready to break her silence, just a little. For decades, Diane Lane avoided the subject entirely. Interviewers tried, tabloids speculated, and fans wondered, but she always kept her past sealed behind a graceful smile. But everything changed the night she appeared at a private Hollywood retrospective honoring her 40-plus years in film. It wasn't televised. It wasn't streamed. It was an invitation-only gathering filled with actors, directors, and, most unexpectedly, several of the artists from her past. Witnesses say the moment Diane stepped onto the softly lit stage, wearing a simple, elegant black dress, the room went silent. There was no script in her hands, no publicist hovering nearby. She took a deep breath, looked at the audience, and for the first time in her career, she let her guard down. She began talking about her youth, the whirlwind of fame, the creative hunger that kept her chasing roles that terrified and inspired her, and the longing for authenticity in a world obsessed with image. Then, gently and naturally, she transitioned into the relationships that shaped those years. She didn't give names. She didn't expose anyone. Instead, she described them as the 7 artists I shared pieces of my life with, each one different, each one unforgettable. The room leaned in. Diane spoke about the painter who introduced her to midnight galleries, the musician who wrote a song only she ever heard, the photographer who captured her in moments no movie camera ever could, and others whose creativity matched her own restless spirit. She called those relationships the education Hollywood never gave me. One attendee later said, "It wasn't gossip. It was poetry." She spoke as if she were closing a chapter that had been open for far too long. For the first time, Diane admitted how deeply those connections influenced her work, the emotional depth in her performances, the heartbreak in her eyes during certain scenes, the quiet strength she carried into every character. It all came from real experiences, real emotions, real people. And when she finished, the room didn't explode in applause. Instead, it gave her a long, respectful silence, the kind reserved for someone who has finally told the truth on her own terms. But what Diane said next surprised everyone. After her emotional confession, Diane paused, resting her hands on the sides of the podium. The room was still, not tense, but electrified, as if everyone sensed something bigger was coming. And they were right. With a soft laugh, she said, "People always ask why I never settled for a simple life. The truth is, I lived 7 lives before I ever turned 40. Then, for the first time in public, she acknowledged the impact each of the 7 artists had on her in ways far deeper than anyone expected. She explained that these weren't fleeting experiences. Each man represented a turning point, a moment where she learned something about herself that changed the course of her life. The painter showed her how to see the world in colors she didn't know existed. The musician taught her how to listen, really listen, to the spaces between words. The sculptor helped her understand stillness, patience, and the beauty of unfinished things. The poet gave her the courage to feel heartbreak without hiding it. The photographer reminded her that truth is sometimes more powerful than perfection. The dancer introduced her to the language of the body, movement, rhythm, surrender. In the final one, she hesitated before speaking, her eyes softening. "He taught me what it means to walk away gracefully." That line changed the entire room. Some attendees later said that you could feel decades of emotion in her voice, love, loss, gratitude, and closure all at once. Diane wasn't exposing scandal, she was reclaiming parts of her past that had been misinterpreted or hidden for too long. Then she addressed the question everyone had silently wondered, why reveal this now? Her answer was simple, because at 60, I finally stopped caring about who approves of my truth. The audience gave a soft, emotional applause, not loud, not dramatic, but deeply respectful. It was the kind of applause reserved for someone who has lived fully, loved fearlessly, and survived beautifully. Her closing words made the moment unforgettable. "I don't regret a single one of them. They were all chapters in a story I'm still writing." But as Diane stepped off the stage, something unexpected happened that would turn the night from reflective to headline-making. As Diane stepped down from the stage, she expected nothing more than a polite farewell, maybe a few warm hugs from old friends. But instead, something happened that no one in the room could have anticipated. From the second row, a man slowly rose to his feet, one of the 7. He wasn't a blockbuster actor. He wasn't a famous face the public would recognize. But anyone in Diane's private circle knew exactly who he was, the photographer, the one who had captured her rawest, most unguarded moments decades earlier. The room went completely silent as he walked toward her. Not dramatic. Not rushing. Just steady, controlled, emotional. Diane froze for a moment. Then, with a soft, surprised smile, she whispered something that only those in the front row could hear. "I didn't think you'd come." He replied, just loud enough for the closest guests, "You told the story. I had to be here to witness the ending." People later said the air felt charged, as if everyone was watching a scene from a film, except this time, it was real. He took her hand gently, and instead of pulling her into some grand gesture, he simply held it. The gesture wasn't romantic or possessive, it was respectful. A tribute to a shared past. A silent acknowledgement of the years they'd lived, separately and together. The audience seemed afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, afraid to interrupt something that felt sacred. Diane looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and awe. It was clear this was not a reunion built on regret, but on closure, the kind only two people who once loved each other deeply could understand. For a moment, it was just the two of them standing there, framed by decades of history. Then another unexpected thing happened. From the back of the room, the musician stood up. On his left, the sculptor. Near the aisle, the poet. And scattered around the dimly lit theater, the remaining artists, all 7, rose in quiet solidarity. Not approaching. Not interrupting. Just standing. A symbolic moment. A visual acknowledgement. A silent salute to the woman who had shaped their art, their memories, and their youth. One journalist later described it perfectly. It felt like watching the ghosts of her past rise to thank her for telling the truth. Diane's eyes filled with tears, not sadness, but the pure, overwhelming weight of being seen. She squeezed the photographer's hand once more, and then something even more unforgettable happened. After the emotional standing tribute, Diane returned to the stage for a final moment. This time, her voice was quieter, measured, but no less powerful. She began to describe, in broad strokes, the essence of her connection with each of the 7 artists, without naming names, but allowing the audience to feel the weight of every relationship. He taught her to see emotion as color. Every brushstroke, every shadow on canvas, reminded her that life was layered, never simple. With him, she learned that creativity and passion could bleed into one another, sometimes painfully, sometimes beautifully. Their connection burned like a flame, illuminating both brilliance and vulnerability. He introduced her to rhythm, to the idea that timing wasn't just a technical skill, it was intimacy. He showed her that desire was not always about urgency, but about knowing when to pause, when to hold back, when anticipation could speak louder than any note or word. With him, she learned patience and passion, and pleasure and subtlety. His touch was deliberate, his understanding precise. With him, Diane discovered the power of stillness and observation, how restraint could heighten intensity, and how letting someone see your quiet strength could be just as exhilarating as surrender. The sculptor's influence lingered in her poise, her movements, and the way she carried herself on screen. Words became weapons, words became warmth, and words became truth. He taught her to explore emotion without fear, to embrace sorrow and joy in equal measure, and to recognize the language of intimacy hidden in syllables and silence. She said, with him, conversation became its own form of seduction. Diane's favorite among the 7 for sheer unpredictability. He taught her that being seen, truly seen, was a double-edged sword. Vulnerability could be intoxicating, and exposure could be empowering. With him, she learned to trust herself, to trust her instincts, and to recognize beauty in imperfection. Energy, motion, rhythm, and surrender. He taught her that bodies could speak in ways words never could, that desire was as much about movement as it was about touch. With him, every encounter became a choreography, a delicate balance between control and abandon, a story told without lines. The man who taught her the hardest lesson of all, when to walk away. He was the only one who left an imprint not on her body, but on her mind, showing her that power often lies in restraint and that love, passion, and desire do not always need permanence to be unforgettable. By the time Diane finished, the audience was silent again, not the awkward silence of uncertainty, but a quiet reverence, the kind that comes when someone has lived boldly, spoken honestly, and shared truth with courage. One attendee later said, "It wasn't gossip. It wasn't scandal. It was a masterclass in life, love, and self-awareness." She owned every part of herself without apology. And then Diane, with a small, enigmatic smile, concluded, "These 7 artists shaped me, challenged me, and taught me who I am. I can't regret a single one of them. They were chapters one needed, lessons I earned, and memories I carry with me, every one." The applause this time was louder, more heartfelt, but never overbearing. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about acknowledgement, the recognition that some lives, some experiences, cannot be reduced to headlines or gossip columns. But even with this acknowledgement came something else, a sense of liberation. Diane had finally reclaimed her story. Not through secrecy. Not through denial. But through honesty. And in that moment, she wasn't just a Hollywood icon. She was a woman who had lived fully, loved deeply, and survived brilliantly. As the applause subsided, Diane stepped away from the podium one final time. There were no cameras capturing the moment for social media. No flashing lights. No screaming fans. Just quiet, reverent acknowledgement, a room full of people who understood that what they had witnessed was not spectacle, but truth. She walked slowly toward the exit, feeling decades of unspoken emotion finally lifting from her shoulders. Each step felt lighter. Each breath, freer. Every secret, once carefully guarded, was now simply part of her story, a story she owned without fear, without shame, without apology. Outside, the cool night air of Hollywood wrapped around her like a protective cloak. For the first time in years, she felt untethered from expectation. Untethered from rumor. Untethered from the need to maintain a flawless public image. She had lived her life with honesty, intensity, and courage, even when the world demanded something else. And now, finally, the world knew only what she chose to share. Over the following days, whispers about her revelation spread. But surprisingly, there were no scandals. No fury. Just fascination. People didn't focus on the sensational aspects. They focused on the woman who had dared to speak her truth with elegance, insight, and emotional bravery. The 7 artists she had referenced, the painter, the musician, the sculptor, the poet, the photographer, the dancer, and the final enigmatic figure, all reached out privately to acknowledge her courage. Some simply expressed admiration. Others thanked her for the honesty that, in subtle ways, had inspired their own work and lives. None of them contested her recollections, all accepted the moment as a rare and beautiful closure to chapters that had once defined them all. Diane reflected on what she had learned from each relationship, each encounter, each moment of intimacy. It wasn't just about desire or passion, it was about self-discovery, empowerment, and understanding the complexities of human connection. Every liaison had left its mark, shaped her craft, and ultimately strengthened her resolve. By sharing these stories, she wasn't seeking validation. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was reclaiming narrative control, proving that a woman, even in the intense glare of Hollywood, could define her own story, her own desires, and her own legacy. Looking back over 60 years, she realized the truth: passion, creativity, love, and risk were inseparable. To live fully in Hollywood, one had to embrace both the art and the chaos. And she had done exactly that, not perfectly, not safely, but fully, honestly, and beautifully. That night, as Diane Lane finally returned home, she felt something she hadn't in decades, a profound sense of peace. The stories that had once haunted her were now liberated, existing only as memories, lessons, and triumphs. She had revealed her truth, embraced her history, and stood tall as a woman who had lived fearlessly. And in that quiet reflection, one thing was clear: the world would remember her not just as a Hollywood icon, but as a woman unafraid to own her life, to name her experiences, and to honor the artists who had helped her become the extraordinary person she was, inside and out. The secrets were finally out. The silence was broken. The truth, scandalous or not, belonged to her, and her alone. Diane Lane had spoken. And the world, for the first time, was ready to listen. Even after the standing ovation and private acknowledgments, Diane Lane knew her story wasn't truly over. Secrecy had shaped her early years, but transparency now defined her later life. There was a profound freedom in claiming her narrative, in revealing the truth about the 7 artists who had helped her become both a legendary actress and a fully realized woman. She spent the following weeks revisiting the chapters of her life, reflecting on moments of passion, heartbreak, and self-discovery. The intensity of those encounters, once fraught with secrecy and societal judgment, had become a source of personal power. Diane realized that each relationship, each passionate liaison, was more than a story to tell. They were lessons in courage, intimacy, and authenticity. Her memoirs began to take shape, not as a sensational exposé, but as a testament to the complexities of life in Hollywood. She explored the artist within each lover, how their creativity intertwined with their desire, and how her interactions with them had sharpened her own artistry. Diana wrote about vulnerability as a strength, about desire as a teacher, and about the unspoken ways intimacy could illuminate the human experience. Her publicists were nervous. Editors worried about reception. Critics speculated. Yet Diane remained unwavering. She had learned over decades that truth, told with grace, carries a power no scandal could ever match. Her revelation wasn't about shock value, it was about reclaiming her own narrative and inspiring others to embrace their truths without fear. Artistic circles responded differently than she expected. Younger actors sought her guidance, hoping to understand how to navigate fame without losing authenticity. Directors and writers reached out, expressing admiration for her fearless honesty. And even the 7 artists she had referenced, once distant, now finally acknowledged, began collaborating again in subtle ways, inspired by the way their shared histories had shaped someone as radiant and uncompromising as Diana. Diane also discovered a quieter, more profound truth. Beyond desire and passion, beyond scandal and secrecy, she had cultivated resilience. The fame, the whispered rumors, the power plays, and the heartbreaks, all of it had forged a woman who could stand in her own truth and remain unshaken. Every private encounter, every intense connection, every stolen moment of intimacy had been part of a journey towards self-mastery. And so, at 60, Diana Lane understood something few Hollywood legends ever truly grasp: her legacy was not measured by box office numbers, awards, or public image. It was measured by the courage to live fully, love honestly, and tell her story on her own terms. The spotlight might fade, tabloids might chase shadows, and gossip might never cease. Yet the truth she carried, the one she had finally shared, was eternal. She sat alone one evening, looking out over the city that had both challenged and inspired her. The neon lights reflected in her eyes, a city alive with stories, ambitions, and secrets. And for the first time in decades, Diana smiled with quiet satisfaction. She had lived, loved, and revealed everything she was meant to. The woman beyond the spotlight had finally been seen, and the world, at last, had listened.